The police shot and murdered a woman after her and her family specifically asked for an ambulance and said they did not want police there. This was 25-year-old Victoria Lee, and roughly around 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, July 28th, at the apartment that she lives at with her family, located in Fort Lee, New Jersey, overlooking Manhattan across the Hudson River. At the Pinnacle Apartments, and roughly around 1 o'clock in the morning that Sunday, Victoria started to randomly roll around in her bed in her room, started briefly shouting, and even began tapping her head lightly against the wall in her room, to which her mother immediately realized from previous times that Victoria was suffering from a manic episode and suggested that Victoria go to a nearby hospital as she had done before. However, Victoria refused. So Victoria's mother, Mrs. Lee, called over Victoria's brother, Chris, and asked him to call 911. And roughly around 1:15 that morning, Chris made the first 911 call of the night, specifically asking the operator for an ambulance only to take Victoria specifically to the Valley Hospital nearby. At which point the operator told him that it was protocol that police accompany the ambulance during a mental health crisis call. And upon hearing that the ambulance along with the police were on their way, Victoria started to get visibly agitated, and in a non-threatening, non-violent way, Victoria picked up a very small pocket knife that was close by and just held onto it. And especially because Victoria had never, not once, even remotely displayed any signs of aggression or violence during one of her manic episodes, in an attempt to try to avoid any misunderstandings and potential escalation by the police, Mrs. Lee told her son Chris to call 911 again to make sure that they have this information to avoid anything like that. So roughly around 1:20 in the morning, Chris calls 911 again to tell them about this very tiny pocket knife that Victoria had and asks that the police not enter the apartment because of it, while also stating that she wasn't a danger to anyone, at which point the 911 operator told Chris again that the police do have to show up as protocol. So Chris had the idea that he was going to go downstairs and try to delay the cops so that Mrs. Lee had enough time to calm Victoria down. But as soon as Chris opened the door to their apartment, the police officer was waiting right outside, at which point their family dog started barking incessantly at the police officer, at which point Mrs. Lee picked up the family dog, closed the door, asked them not to come inside, and she put the dog away in his crate. And it was at this point that the officer who was standing outside of the apartment door in the hallway with Chris started knocking on the door while asking Chris who was inside, who Chris told the officer was his sister Victoria and their mother. Now, according to the Lee family, it was at this time that the officer started asking Chris for a key to the apartment, which Chris didn't have, because it wasn't like he was going to the grocery store and needed to lock up the house. It was past 1 o'clock in the morning and he was just stepping outside to talk to the police officer. And when Chris told the police officer this, according to Chris, the police officer pushed Chris aside and immediately started to forcefully try to kick the door in. And it was at this time when other police officers started arriving on the scene, and when Chris saw one of the officers take out a taser gun, it started to calm his nerves, so he started cooperating with the police when one of the officers told him to get out of the way and stand in the stairwell. And while the police officers continued to try to kick down the front door to their apartment, mind you, without having waited for the ambulance or the medical professionals to arrive on the scene yet, inside of the apartment was Mrs. Lee, who had effectively calmed down Victoria enough to the point that Victoria had dropped that small pocket knife and it landed roughly about 7 feet away from that door. In fact, Victoria had become calm enough and was still so confused that after she had dropped the very small pocket knife, she actually picked up a 5-gallon bottle of water and just held it in her hand while her mother continued to guard the door, holding onto the handle, repeatedly yelling at the police to not enter their apartment. And when the police finally kicked in the door of an apartment where, by the way, no crime was actually being committed in, or where the residents were repeatedly telling them that they were not welcome inside, as the door flung open, Mrs. Lee stumbled backwards and was standing behind Victoria at the moment the door opened, and within barely a second of that door starting to open, and this statement that was put out by the New Jersey Attorney General's office stated that as soon as the door was opened, a single shot was fired, striking Victoria in the chest by Officer Tony Pickens Jr. And just a reminder, at this point, the ambulance that was originally supposed to be on the scene, that was supposed to lead this mental health call, still had not even arrived on the scene yet. And when one of the officers tried to jankily provide first aid to Victoria, the officers decided that they weren't even going to wait for a stretcher and just carried Victoria downstairs after separating her from her family. Victoria Lee was a human being, an American, who identified as an artist who loved the music industry. In fact, in her bio on her LinkedIn, she clearly writes, "My passions in life are music, business, and service." Does that sound like someone who deserved to be shot down dead in their home? And Victoria Lee was dedicated to the art of music. Music, which is supposed to be healing and restorative, especially for people who suffer from mental health oftentimes. And the world was robbed of this beautiful woman who had so much to give to the world, all because police decided that they wanted to work outside of the restraints of the law. In the town of Fort Lee, New Jersey, where over 60% of its residents don't even speak English at home, where 23.5% of its residents in 2010 were Korean. This is the chief of police for Fort Lee Police Department, Matthew Hintz. You can contact him directly here, or according to this very publicly available document, you can also email him here and let him know that Tony Pickens Jr. here, who's proudly accepting some award for being a police officer, does not deserve to be a police officer, and that we demand that the body cam from Tony Pickens Jr. that day is released immediately. Because this is now the third case in the last 5 months where an Asian American person who was suffering from a mental health crisis was murdered by police. And we are not going to accept this anymore, because Victoria Lee should be alive today. Rest in peace, Victoria Lee.